So in the video you watched last night, we talked about some problematic methods for sampling, namely voluntary response samples and convenience samples. And the reason that those two methods for sampling are problematic is because they introduce bias into your data. And in order to avoid bias, we need samples that are chosen by chance instead. In other words, we need our samples to be chosen randomly instead of having some sort of choice in the matter, whether that's the person volunteering to be a part of the sample or whether that's the sample taker choosing who they are going to select to be in their sample. So we don't want either of those situations. We want individuals chosen randomly. In order to do that, sometimes we will conduct what's called a simple random sample, which is abbreviated SRS in your textbook, and you'll see that show up quite a bit. In an SRS, every individual in your population is going to have an equal chance of being chosen. So of course that means that if everyone has an equal chance, then we can't be biased towards who is or is not going to be included. Additionally, for an SRS, every possible sample is going to have an equal chance of being chosen. There are some sampling methods that are random where every sample does not have an equal chance of being chosen, and we'll talk about those sampling methods a little bit later on in this section. We just need to keep in mind that for an SRS, every individual and every possible sample, they both have equal chances of being chosen. In order for you to pull an SRS, of course, you're going to need a random selection of your individuals. That randomization is what keeps us from having a biased sample result, And randomization is going to be possible either by using a random number table or a random number generator, and we're going to get some random values, and those random values are going to allow us to decide which members of our population we're going to include in our sample. And we took a look at a random number table the other day in class, and there is one in the back of your book. It's labeled Table B. But in any random table, a random number table, two things have to be true. Each digit, 0 through 9, has to be equally likely to occur, and also each entry has to be independent of every other entry. So that just means that if you were to count up, or at least statement number 1 means that if you were to count up the number of occurrences of each digit in a random number table, each digit should occur approximately the same number of times. And statement number 2 means that for each entry, if they're all independent, that means whatever any individual entry is, that has absolutely no effect on what the next entry is going to be. So just because an entry in a random number table, maybe 1 is 0, that doesn't preclude the next entry to also be 0, because each digit is going to be equally likely to occur in any one particular position. So again, a random number table is just one way that you can generate the random numbers you need to get your SRS. You can also use a random number generator. There is a random number generator built into your calculator, and we'll talk about how to use that. Or you can find one on a computer, on the internet pretty easily. So, how do you go about choosing a simple random sample? The first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to label each element in your population with some sort of digit. If you think back to the random rectangles, or the area of rectangles experiment that we did in class yesterday, we had each of the little shapes assigned to a 2-digit number, 0, 1, all the way up to 0, 0, which stands for 100. And then what we did when we got our random sample is we decided we were going to take a certain line from our random number table. Remember, each of you chose a different row, and then we used that row of random digits to choose the random numbers, or to set the random numbers that you were going to use to choose the shapes that you were going to look at. So again, step 1 is to label the elements in your population. Step 2 is to choose the random numbers you're going to use. Step 3 is to figure out when you're going to stop taking random numbers. Basically, that just means how big is your sample going to be. And later on in this course, we're going to talk about how you can determine what is an appropriate sample size. Once you've figured out which random numbers you're going to use and how many of you need, then you're going to identify the individuals in your sample that correspond to those random numbers that you've selected. So let's talk through a little example. Let's go back to the situation where we want to calculate the average height of students at St. Francis. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to have to label the entire population of students. Now that doesn't mean that we have to actually go through one by one and label everybody. But what the easiest thing to do would be to take our population of students, and right now we've got 150 students at St. Francis, and we could just simply alphabetize everybody's name and put everyone's name in alphabetical order. Once we've got everybody listed in alphabetical order, we can then number everyone from 150, or excuse me, from 1 up to 150. Now, something you need to keep in mind is that you need to have the same number of digits for everybody in your population. So, for instance, whoever is at the very top of the alphabetical list would be given a 3-digit number 001 to represent them. And then the person at the very end of our list would be given the digits 150. Notice we've got 3 digits for both of those numbers. The reason we need all of our individuals in the population to be given the same number of digits is that so when we go to our random number generator, everybody's got the same chance of being selected. We don't want to call the first person on our list number 1 and then the last person number 150, because notice that last person then would have a different probability of being selected because the digits 150 would appear in order far less frequently than just the number 1 in our random number table. I don't know why this is all of a sudden so flat. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so we've labeled all the students in our population from 001 up to 150. Then what we would need to do is select some random numbers, and we would also need to decide how many students we want in our sample. So maybe we just decide that we want 10 students in our sample. So then we would need to select 10 random numbers. And we could either do that again using a random number table or by finding those 10 random numbers on or with a random number generator, whether that's with your calculator or on a computer. Then our last step is going to be to identify the individuals in the sample. So we take those 10 random numbers that we got, remember there's going to be 3 digits, and then we're going to just match up those 3 digits to the names of the 10 people whose entries correspond to those 10 random numbers that we got. And once you do that, you've got your simple random sample.